So there you go, that's probably the most exciting thing you'll see all day. I will try to do better. Bitch on Heat is not my first book, but it's probably my first proper book. And there's two versions of it. A pure pulp edition, and the version I did with James, which is what we'll be focusing on today, the hard-boiled hybrid, which forms the basis of this dialogue that we're going to have today. James, by the way, is a bit of a rock star in the world of illustration. I also thought he would give me some credibility with a younger demographic. A third of the book is graphics. So James will come in and talk a bit about that a third of the way through this conversation. But before we get to that,
here for now.
Sorry, it's just he makes me look better because he's much better looking than I am. But before we get to that, we should probably cover off how we got here. And just briefly, by way of introduction, I graduated from the West Australian Academy of Performing Arts in 1990. Which is the same school as Hugh Jackman. That's not important, except that you should know I could have been Wolverine. But more than that, it probably means a bit that I come from a bit of an entertainment background, which kind of informs a few of my beliefs when it comes to storytelling. But I came to Hong Kong in 1990, 91, and have been trying to get out of advertising ever since. Again, that's not really that important, except that it kind of informs my approach to writing. And I wrote my first book in 2002, 2003. It was called The Durian Effect, and it's a fictional memoir. And by that we mean it's real events, but with fictional characters, told from a first-person point of view. I guess it all happened, but it didn't all happen to me. Fictional memoir. And it was also here that Richard Tong was born. Some people write under a nom de plume for contractual reasons, business reasons, cosmetic reasons, political reasons. This was more for creative reasons. To maintain a suspension of disbelief. The main character for The Durian Effect, and actually in all the subsequent books, is of mixed race. And I made the choice to use my Chinese name at the time. I say at the time because I have a really good feng shui man, and he has since changed my name again. But we can talk about that sort of stuff later. But my time then was Tong Wai Chek, hence Richard Tong. Phonetically, there's some sort of relationship between that. I think also it allowed me to put a bit of distance between this type of creative and my professional pursuits. That separation of church and state, if you will. But anyway, the book, The Durian Effect, excuse me, it's very raw. I think it was my attempt to do sort of Bukowski. It has a three-part structure. Outside looking in, turmoil, inside looking out, and it was the sort of book that 2 or 3 people bought 2 or 3 copies of thank you, Scott, for visitors and friends overseas, mainly because I think it gave them an honest insight into a particular time and place, which was Hong Kong 10 years before their handover, straddling the handover, and 10 years after. I got mail for 5 years, not 10, sorry. And I felt a little bit ratified because of that. I actually got fan mail, believe it or not, from ABCs and BBCs and local people who could relate to the tone of voice and the candid nature of the bicultural experience, which I guess in a way validated that creative decision to use a hybrid name. If I had put Richard Tunbridge on the cover, it's a very English name, and I think it wouldn't have been half as convincing, because it would have just sounded like another stupid guilo talking about stuff. And also at that point, I had a job and I wasn't thinking of writing another book. So it didn't seem like such a big deal at the time, except inevitably people asked, those handful of people that read the first one said, are you going to write another one? I'm not sure if that was a rhetorical question, or almost like, please don't. But we were having our first child, which is this one down here. And I noticed that there was a lot of fatherhood books in the West and a lot of rules and guides for raising children in the East. But no one had really looked at the experience from a bicultural point of view. And so there seemed to be an opportunity to exploit the conflict and some of the humour there. And so a sequel was born, and Richard Tong evolved a little bit more because he existed now. In advertising we say he had equity. And I thought I could build upon my audience, except the opposite happened. I traded my audience. Those that bought into the rawness of the first were probably disappointed by the family-friendly nature of the second. So I lost men, but I picked up women, so to speak. And I was also savaged by the South China Morning Post. And I think that was because I was trying to be funny all the time, which is not something anyone should do. It's better to build to a gag. Peaks and troughs. You might wonder what joke I'm building to now. It's coming, I hope. Seriously, I did continue to get mail from those, and I don't mean mail as in mails, I mean letters. Back then people still wrote letters. This was 2005. But I got mail from people dealing with cross-cultural pedigree and experience. So the tone of voice and aspects of the style that I had invented for this author, for Tong, were resonating. It was also here that I began flirting with incorporating graphics into the story. And I got quite a famous advertising guy called Ned McNeilage to do the illustrations. But his brief was to respond to specific chapters visually. It wasn't actually to tell part of the story or a scene from the story, but just to respond to it. So in some way with Me and My Potato, you could take the illustrations out and the story would still make sense. That's not the case with what we've done with Bitch on Heat. They're an integral part of the story, but we'll talk a bit more about that later. Just on the guy responsible for these illustrations, Ned, has gone on to much bigger and better things than I have. Bless him. He just won the Audience Award at the Palm Springs Film Festival and was chosen as the closing film at the Tribeca Film Festival for a documentary. So that should be quite encouraging for James in terms of collaborations with me. Usually work out better for the other person. But James also is working on a film at the moment, doing character development. We can talk a little bit more about how that aspect of collaboration moves on. But so no pressure on you, James, after Ned's success. I think the main thing I learned from these first two efforts, to be honest, was how not to write a book. They focused more on the what rather than the how. So they had the idea, but they sort of failed in execution in a way. Lost people halfway through, or endings very hard to do. And people who have read those will tell you the same things. The endings don't quite click. But if you do look at those, all the elements for the current trilogy, and there is 3 of these, were in there. Fictional characters, real-world environments, an immediate raw tone of voice, a combination of contemporary prose and graphics, and identity issues, which perhaps says more about me as an author than it says about the books. Unfortunately, they're both out of print now, but they have found a box of them somewhere, and they are on sale downstairs and out the front at heavily discounted prices. They may be re-released as ebooks one day, but don't hold your breath. They're interesting, but they're very raw, and in some ways a little bit immature, but some people like that sort of rawness. And they're in the Hong Kong Library, and that's where they keep coming back to visit me, because people find them in the library and then they write you a letter, which I just didn't think would happen 10 years after you did something. They're also selling on Amazon and eBay at ridiculously inflated prices, so you actually are better off buying them here if you want to get them, but I'm not going to sell too much. One other thing that happened though, which I think is really interesting, not just for me, but how things can take on a life of their own and you don't actually have much control of them. In the same way I didn't really intend for Richard Tong to become something. I Googled myself in preparation for this just to see if I could find out something interesting about myself. But I found them being discussed in reference materials by these 2 guys from New York who are at New York University, and they did the Rutledge Concise History of Southeast Asian Writing. So Tong seems to have entered into the Asian lexicon, which is just kind of weird. You just don't sort of think that stuff actually happens, but I didn't even realise there was a history of Southeast Asian writing. But it's in there now, so maybe they have some value for others beyond what I learnt from them and storytelling. But so that's background. Where did that sort of leave me, and how did that get me meeting with James? I was still working in advertising and raising a family, and I had 2 kids by then. And like I said, the Feng Shui man had changed my name to Tan Wai Da. And I had some time to think, and I wrote a short story, very personal short story, and that ended up getting syndicated in Australian magazines. And it was by sort of working out why did that happen, because it wasn't a particularly amazing story. It was very personal, but again, it seemed to resonate with people, and I think what connected with people and what I learned from it was if you write about something you know and something you like and something you fear, you'll probably tap into something quite interesting. Which was really the starting point for this adventure. I just sort of figured if writing was to be more than an expensive hobby, I had to sort of conceive a scalable world, a time and a place populated by recurring and evolving characters that you could engage and move forward in a story with, rather than just sit back and look at them, is hopefully you could get involved with them. So I liked classic noir from the 30s and 50s, your Dashiell Hammetts and your Raymond Chandlers. I like contemporary noir by people like James Ellroy. And I like the punchiness of people like Elmore Leonard and Kinky Friedman. I'm not putting myself on any of those levels, but this is where you start thinking about what you like. And what kind of stories would you like to tell? I liked, and I still love, Hong Kong, and I know it pretty well. I've been here since 1990. But I'd always thought it was underused as a character for storytelling. Hong Kong features a lot in international stories, but usually as a backdrop. You know, there's very Hong Kong stories and Hong Kong films, but they don't go really to an international audience. Maybe they're too local in some ways, but I was also thinking that, you know, if you want to tell a story for the world, you should involve your location as a character. And that's something I just thought a lot of people from the West, or even local people writing English out to the world, just sort of used as a backdrop. But Hong Kong has a very strong, multifaceted character, and I think we're finding that more and more out as we go along this year even. That it has a very strong character of its own that maybe people have discounted for quite some time. And so that sort of provided the inspiration and guide, and it kind of became my muse, sort of like the city beneath the city, rather than the tourist city that lives on top. Maybe just take a little quiet corner, and how do some people live out their lives? But of course it's in the past, so lived out their lives back in the early 80s. And I guess when I talk about things you like and things you know, and then there's the thing you fear. And apart from being up here on stage in front of people, the other thing I fear was actually being a single father. And I had real moments of anxiety over my own identity. I still do. And they're ongoing themes that I've noticed, whether it's actually my professional, personal pursuits. It's always trying to tap into identity. I was adopted at a very early age. And this whole existential, where do I come from, angst, was compounded with the arriving of my own children, because people would ask you and you go, well, I don't know. You know, so it does become, I think as you get older, you start to think about things like that. I had no connection to really what I was, or who and where I came from. I mean, I knew what country I came from and I knew who my adoptive parents were, but that was it. I had no personal history beyond those moments. And so maybe that's also why I have an affinity for Hong Kong, because we are hybrid byproducts of an arranged marriage too. But I don't want to be that deep today. So I'll get back to the story. I don't want to oversimplify the process, but basically what I decided to do, isn't James really patient? This is why I like to work with him. I thought I had to do was take all of that kind of stuff and bring it together with a bunch of unique characters, and then just throw a problem at them. And how those characters solve the problem becomes the story. And there was one other overriding caveat, was that it had to be entertaining. I think you can learn something from it, but it shouldn't be education disguised as entertainment. It doesn't actually have to be about anything. It should be fun. You can learn something along the way. You know, you look at a lot of work in this particular genre, and it does leverage social and political aspects, but you get that via osmosis. It doesn't set out to tell you what life was like in that time, but you learn what life is like in that time after you have gone through the experience. You know, the ancient Greeks would go and see Oedipus Rex every year for 100 years. And it wasn't the plot that engaged them year after year. It was the way it was told. It was also probably the only show at the Acropolis. But it was more about the how the story was told more than what was being told. People went to see how the story played out. Another example, you know the Titanic is going to hit the iceberg, but you sit there for 2 hours to see what happens before. And then after an hour, you're saying, like, bring on the iceberg. But again, it's more about the how than the what. So I thought, well, let's just take the oldest plots in the world, but have them enacted by fresh characters in interesting times. And I thought the mid-80s was very interesting times for Hong Kong. So we sat down and we basically created this 1930s genre piece set in Hong Kong in the 80s with 21st century sensibilities, which, you know, isn't as easy as it sounds. So before I get to James, there was one more step before we got today, and I wrote all 3 stories, the first 3 stories in one setting. So this is one, and there's 2 more that have been written and are coming. But I thought to create a world, therefore, if you're writing 3 all at once, the characters from this can inform the second and thirds, and you can have people walk through this book and you sort of don't know why they're there, and then they appear in the third book. I don't know if anyone remembers Quentin Tarantino's trilogy of Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs and True Romance, but there are characters in those three films that are in the background of one, and then they come to the foreground in another, and they're discussed in one, and they were killed in another, and it's a complete universe. Even though they're independent films, they do inform each other. So that was one of the things I wanted to do with this, was it would probably help the process if you create an entire world in one go, rather than do one, see how people respond to it, and then sit down and try and remember how you got there. There was also this other idea that was prompted by observations and conversations with people, and I don't know if anyone's seen Neil Gaiman's The Sandman series, but he took what was basically a very traditional plot-driven world of graphic novels and made them very character-driven. And there was a book called The Invention of Hugo Cabret by Selznick, which was made into Hugo by Martin Scorsese. And that segued between traditional prose and graphics to tell its story. And in Japan, there is an increasing number of hybrid novels which take graphics and prose and bring them all together. And then you look at how people are consuming their entertainment now. It switches from YouTube to Twitter to Facebook to Weibo to whatever your preferred social media platform is, QQ, magazines, multimedia, multi-formatted entertainment. People switch between the two now, and almost without even thinking about it. If you actually ask someone, they probably wouldn't remember that they'd actually seen that story in bits across 3 different media, whether it's the news or entertainment. And someone who read one of the first drafts of the first books made a comment that it would also be a pretty cool graphic novel. And so that's why we're here with 2 versions of the same story. You have this hybrid hardback for neo-noirists who want a bit more bang for their buck, and then we have pure pulp versions for those who like it straight up. I think also I believed in the strength of the writing, but I also thought it could be enhanced with a graphic element. I also wanted to respect the origins of noir and have a dime store novel. But ultimately, I think what happens, and if you listen to people like Neil Young, the musician, people should be able to engage a story in any way they like now. It shouldn't be told that now you buy the hardback, 6 months later you get a cheaper version of the paperback, and then there's an e-book you can have, but only when the publisher tells you. It just sort of seemed, why not, quite disruptive. Why don't we just put different versions of the story out there at the same time? And then if people want something simple, they can have it. If they want something a little bit more interesting, they can have it. And you can just sort of see it build. The only problem with that is you end up having to write the story twice to accommodate the story with regard to the execution of visuals, which is what I was getting to before. A lot of books have graphics, but they support the story. They're not part of the story. You can take the graphics out and still the story makes perfect sense. With this one, you actually can't. You take the graphics out and the story would would have huge holes in it. Hence, with this version, you get the uninterrupted one. But this one, the graphics are interwoven with it. But you have to find someone to go on that journey with you, which is not as easy as you might think. James was one of the few illustrators we spoke to that wanted to try a long-form narrative. A lot of people just want to do the short story, their flat frames, and get paid and get out of town for reasons that probably James will discuss. Why he took on the project, but he puts obviously the vital art of collaboration into the hybrid storytelling thing, and it wouldn't be very hybrid without him either. So maybe, James, you could just tell people a little bit about what you do and why you do it.
Yeah, so I'm James. Hi. Finally get to speak. So I guess I always wondered why Richard picked me to do the artwork for this book, actually, because this is what my portfolio looks like, and it's, if you've seen the book, the graphics in there, it's nothing like the stuff that you actually see in the book. It's very different. So I always wondered that, but actually, just listening to him talk just now, I realized it's about the hybrid like Western and Eastern cultures that I guess comes through in my artwork. And I was born in Hong Kong, but I was raised in Canada, and then I came back for high school, and then I went back to the States for college. After college, I came back. So basically, I've been moving between East and West my whole life, and I think it shows through in my artwork. So I always liked drawing, and ever since I was a kid, I knew I wanted to be an illustrator. So basically, I'm living the dream now, I guess you can say. But so my job is always listen to a brief and turn the client's ideas into a visual. But what I found interesting about this project with Richard is that he gave me a lot of freedom to explore how I wanted to deliver the artwork, not just deliver the artwork in the way he saw it to fit. So I felt like I could really inject a lot of my personality into the artwork, and I think that's why it will make for. I think that's why I was willing to go on a long haul project, because I feel I could make this work also part of my own. Like I could feel like I can say I did this and I can be proud of it, because it's a good representation of who I am as well.
So at first, James might not have seemed like the most obvious choice for this, but if you look at what he does from another point of view, it's a very strong sense of character and a very strong sense of time and place, and also that idea of combining aspects of culture into something quite unique. So I could see that he could bring something of that, not literally, but laterally, to these characters and the world that we were building. Because you need someone who would commit to a long-form narrative, who understood the genre, but who would work organically to interpret the story, which is something also not a lot of people can do. People like to be told, well, you do whatever you like, or they be told, you do this. Not, here's a starting point and we have to get to here. You tell me how you want to get there. I've got the what, but you need to tell me the how. So the story needed to be a bit of what I call a cultural mongrel, because of the time and place involved, and because of the characters involved, and maybe like me and him, I guess, cultural mongrels, and like the characters in the story. It needed to reflect the city, or an aspect of the city, or a couple of people that live in the city. It's important to know that it's not about Hong Kong, but you learn a bit about a piece of Hong Kong through that journey. It's not trying to educate, but it's just giving you a little window into the lives of a couple of people at a particular time. And we wanted the style to sort of reflect the story in the city in the same way that, you turn around a corner in Hong Kong and bang, there's something dramatic going on, and and those sorts of things. You should turn a page and bang, there should be something dramatic there, striking and unexpected, and it should feel and taste very sort of Hong Kong. And so we drew upon our individual experiences and collective interests. So obviously I'm responsible for the story, but when it comes to the visual components, I would just deal with the what, getting from A to B, and then I would make James more responsible for how we got there. And we would sit down and discuss, well, these frames could go from here to here, and this could sort of happen, and he would do a lot of interpretation of the visual part of the story. So what's next is the second book is called Sayonara, Mitch. Sorry, children. And in the same way that the first book kind of deals a bit with mainland China and political and social issues of the time, like the crash of '87 and AIDS, this one has a bit more of a Japanese flavour, leveraging some of those pages in Hong Kong's history and different parts of our subculture. And we are evolving the visual style to reflect some of those aspects of the story. It will be a little bit more bolder. It might be a little bit more abstract, moodier, noirier. It'll be grittier, because the second one always is a bit darker. There will be less weapons, but there will be more violence, which I know sounds like a bit of a contradiction, but there's not just physical violence, there is emotional violence. And all part of the same universe, 1 year on. So this Bitch on Heat is 1987, Sayonara Bitch is 1988, and then Happy Birthday is the third installment, and dealing with some of the issues of Tiananmen Square. I don't say deals with the issues; they're just texture in the background of things that are going on, and that everyone is dealing with. And as we all know, people deal with things in the background in personal ways. Might be a little contentious for some. But it was a dominant event of that year, let's face it. So if these characters exist in that time and place, they will deal with it in their own way too. And then once you've finished with this arc of these three, we could take a leap forward in time, or we could go back in time. How did Jack become Jack So? Or what is he like today, 20 years on? How did he fare as a father? Because he is a single father. And in today's world, what are his daughters like now? What happened to them, the consequences of his actions? You have a lot more freedom to move now. And of course, in the interim, there are other ways you can stay connected with the characters and the stories. Apart from James having a very rich life online. One of the things we thought might be more interesting to do, instead of setting up traditional pages for the book and author, was set up pages for the characters and bring them to life a little bit more. Again, we have fictional characters operating in a real world, and these guys operating from the past in the present seem to be a slightly more disruptive way to do it. So you can all be friends with Jack So and follow him and his advertising agency on Facebook, which is quite interesting because within 4 weeks, the fictional advertising agency had more likes than most real advertising agencies, which sort of blurs the sort of lines between truth and fiction, and maybe all advertising is a fiction anyway. But I thought that was kind of interesting, that a fictional advertising agency engages the world more than a real one. His advertising agency, So For Hugh, is proving to be quite popular. And of course you can dive deeper into James's extraordinary world as well, and there's probably a lot more interesting things than this sort of more one-dimensional approach that you can sort of look at there. So thank you. If anyone has any questions, James will answer them.
I feel like I should clap for part of the audience.
Don't be
Richard
shy.
is going to give out 5 free copies of his book, so for the first 5 of the guests that raise questions, we receive 1 free copy.
Oh, look, there we go.
It's nice. So please do not hesitate to raise your question.
Hello, you mentioned Tarantino's influence on your books.
Yes.
So how did that happen? I mean, why did you draw your inspiration from Tarantino's films and maybe transform that into your own genre in creative writing?
It's a very good question. I think if you go back and look at what Tarantino did with Reservoir Dogs, he actually, they say, stole a very famous Hong Kong film called City on Fire. Hence also this title, seeing as you brought it up, is a bit of an homage to that Hong Kong film, City on Fire, Bitch on Heat. It's not that deep, but it's those types of things. with Reservoir Dogs and particularly with Pulp Fiction, what Tarantino did was pretty much change film with his style. If you look at all the films that came after Pulp Fiction, it changed narratives. And what Tarantino does is he takes traditional genres and infuses them with a very pop sensibility. And he draws upon literature and film and popular culture and art and integrates those. And it's a very contemporary way of storytelling. And so this being an homage to a genre, I think that's sort of where a lot of that thinking came from, was that, you know, contemporary storytelling can draw from many things, and so long as you stay true to the genre, you can have a lot of fun with it. And I think that's one of the things. He's a very contemporary storyteller. I know some people consider themselves maybe authors and those sorts of things. I was talking about earlier, I actually kind of see the role more as being an entertainer. Some people sing to entertain. Some people draw to entertain. Some people perform to entertain. I kind of see the role of the author is to write to entertain. And if you learn something along the way, then that's a bonus. But to me, I always thought this sort of stuff should be more about entertainment. And I think that's where Tarantino comes from, is he's very entertaining. And he pulls genres and makes them very contemporary. Like I said, this is a 1930s genre. But it's about the 80s, and it's told from a 21st century sensibility, which is kind of where a lot of those contemporary filmmakers go. Obviously not putting myself on that level, but that's where the thinking, I think, started to manifest itself. Have a book.
Who else?
Yes?
Yeah, I have to be honest. I'm asking a question for the freebies. I mean, for the free books.
That's okay.
So.
Don't even ask the question. Just have the book.
For the sake of the book, yes, thank you. Can we find that animation clips we watch in the beginnings on YouTube?
Yes.
Have you uploads on YouTube?
It's all there. Yes.
And I do have a question about your collaborations.
And this is you only get one book. You have two questions.
Gosh, no.
But
Okay. So you two sit down and talk about on your collaborations. But if there's conflict, who got the final words?
me.
No, of course
that's
he
not
does.
true.
Right? That's not true.
He's paying me, so of course he gets the final word.
No. That's actually, no, because that would be, I'm not a bully, although some people think I am. It's part of collaboration is knowing, I think, when to concede ground and to recognize an idea. And I think that's where your training, or my training in advertising, is very helpful, because you deal with ideas or non-ideas every day, and you can only, well, arguably, Scott might argue, get to a certain point where you acknowledge what is a better idea or recognize an idea. So there were many instances in this where I was predisposed to a set of to a scene and how it should play out, but James would interpret it, and I go, actually, that's much cooler than I thought it would be. And then I would just take the credit for that afterwards, and thank him very much for making me look better than I probably am.
And just to add on that,
3 to go.
Richard was saying some illustrator just wanted to get in and get out, or just have a very direct brief, do it, and don't really inject himself into the project. The reason why I think, I mean, he's paying me. He's actually the client. It's not really a collaboration. He's the boss. So, but to call it a collaboration might work. Might be accurate, because he's actually given me a lot more room than any of my clients have had in the past to put my character into these drawings, and that's why I'm very excited about continuing to second and third book with him.
You've already got one. Ask someone up the back.
You can ask the sixth question.
Hi, thanks. Just continue the question. When you guys collaborate on that, does the story or the character evolve over time? So you mentioned that you give something to James, and he said, "Oh, he turned into something much cooler." Does the story sort of evolve and change, sort of different from your original idea?
The story here does. I mean, the whole thing is story driven. But what I did find is a very good question, actually, because actually I've had to rewrite the third book. Although they were all finished and done and dusted, I realised that changes I had made to this, because we had some ideas there, had to be touched up within. But by making it, it's like the butterfly or the domino effect, that has actually informed and affected the second book to a degree now that the changes there have radically changed the third book to the point where I actually have to rewrite it. So the story is still the same, but it has had to make changes and the characters had to evolve a little bit differently because of some of the decisions. And I think that's part of the organic approach to writing a story, and the way these stories were written was the plot was kind of there, but the story came out of people solving the problem. So you have a very good understanding of who the characters are. You throw the problem in and they make a change to it, or we guide them through a change to it. But that tells you what has to happen next, is the next problem. And so how does that get solved, and so on and so forth. And there are decisions made in this first story that I hadn't planned to make, and I should say the characters hadn't seen coming, that did inform the second book to the point where actually it was like, wow, I didn't know he was going to do that. And now it's changed some of the psychology of the second and third books. So, wow, you should get a book with pictures for asking such a good question.
And to add on that, actually, the art actually changed over time too, because we divided the first book into 4 batches of briefs. So during the first brief, it wasn't that dark, it wasn't that violent. It was mostly witty. And then when more violence came, the art actually got darker, and it went to a point where I actually really wanted to switch the style, but of course I can't do that to him in the middle of a book. So I had to finish the rest of the book using the style that we set up in the beginning. But I actually think that really built up to the style that we have developed now for the second book, which is, I feel, if I was to do it again, I would have applied the style now for the second book to the first book.
Well, thanks for telling me now. Anyone else? Oh, there's a lady down the back.
Hello. In terms of setting, it's been mentioned that the 80s was of interest to you, and the first question is why, and the second question, you mentioned quote unquote emotional violence in one of your books, and how about the future trend? Would there be some sort of quote unquote emotional peace? And if that is one of the possibilities, how would the illustration be adapted to such idea? Thank you.
Wow. I now have to go back and remember the first question. It's set in the 80s. I always thought the 80s was a very interesting time, not just because I grew up in it, but there was no technology then. And technology was just coming in, but I like the idea of people solving problems the old-fashioned way, with a bit of cunning and guile and traditional violence. And I always kind of just hate it these days, where you're watching a film and they write themselves into a corner and they say, oh, we'll get them on the internet, or, oh, the mobile phone, you know, and those sorts of things. It's just thought if you were to introduce technology into this, it would be because it's the absence of technology that its introduction makes it interesting. So in 88, they are dealing with the introduction of the Mac, but not very well. You know, one person has a mobile phone, but it's kind of like an object of ridicule rather than a lifeline to anything. And so that was just kind of it. I just thought, also, I think Hong Kong in the 80s was a very interesting place. It had been signed off to back to sovereignty, to the mainland. There was a lot of uncertainty, not just politically, but also socially. and then you had AIDS and the financial crisis and all those things. It just seemed to be a time where there was a lot of conflict, which makes for good, interesting storytelling. And also I think the 80s is so far back in time now that no one could really contradict you whether it was true or not, because it's 30, 40 years ago now, so it's like vintage. And it's kind of quirky. But so that was that. Can I ask you, what was the second part of the question?
Emotional violence.
Emotional
and
violence.
How do characters reach emotional peace? Is that correct?
Wow, James, you should have a book. Well, again, maybe it reflects your own personal experiences, and as you get a bit older, you start to look at these things. But I think also once you have children, you start to see the impact that violence and things can be affecting people without actually physical harm, and that mental scars and the psychology of something can be much more powerful and much more terrifying than a physical incursion sometimes. And I think that was the thing. The lead character is a product of violence. He was born into violence and has conducted his life, and he is trying to move away from it. And through an act of violence, he has become a single father. So how does he protect this innocence from the darkness? It's not that deep, but it is in there, and that's part of the evolution of the characters. Some of the physical violence has a very big emotional impact on his daughter. And so how does he deal with that in the second story and the third story? And then how is that reflected visually? And I think we alluded a little bit to that, is that the visuals become a bit darker, they do become a bit more abstract, and the violence, when it's explosive, is very short, but the effects of that linger on through the story and through the arc of the story. So it is one of the sort of challenges, but I think it's also sort of important, once you get over the shock and awe of the first one, how do you maintain interest so it's not same old and just more and more expensive? How do you evolve it? And it seemed to us that the evolution would be the decisions made in this story would have consequences for all in the stories to come, and to play out those consequences, which again comes back to that thing of have a problem and see how they solve it, rather than like Harry Potter, which preordains the 6-7 years of school and what is the issue in this book and what is the issue in that book and how do we get to the end. It's more about the how it happens rather than the what is happening. You know, they have a plot, it's wafer thin, but I think it's the way the stories are told and the things they make you think about that might make them a little bit fresher than just another cops and robbers story. One left for one lucky reader. No? Cameron, scared you off? Oh, you've had all your questions answered. Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's probably it then. Ah. Into Chinese, yes. Eventually. It's not as easy as it sounds. I say that not because I'm stalling, but actually it's very colloquial dialogue. And I don't think it would be a matter of translation, it would be a matter of interpretation. And you would need, in the same way, it's very hard to find someone that understands genre and can work with you on maintaining the integrity of the idea. It's very hard to find writers, when you're very colloquial-based language, to maintain the integrity of that tone of voice and make sure that they're still sounding like that type of character and not like a translation that Google Plus did. Because there is nuance to some of the writing and to some of the characters, and it is quite sort of colloquial. So it would take quite a long time, and you'd have to, again, in the same way you sit down and work with someone and collaborate on the visual interpretation, you'd have to sit down and collaborate with someone on the vernacular interpretation. And having had some initial discussions with people, it's not as easy as I thought it might be. So we might try with some of the easier first books and then move this on. But I don't know, I'd like to. I think it would get to a bigger audience. And I think there's a lot of people could probably, like I said, engage it in a way that is more comfortable for them. Because sometimes when you write in colloquial English, it is hard for people with English as a second language to get their heads around the nuance of some of it, and that sort of thing. I know even my wife sometimes has trouble understanding things I say. So that probably says more about me. Do you like a book, little boy? Or okay, Mr. Silverman?
I don't expect a book. But what fascinates me is Taiwan has gone through years of feeling betrayed and just being alone. And whether your characters in the next stories are going to feel betrayed in terms of, well, the English leaving in 1997, and whether the betrayal is one of acceptance or resistance, and how that can play into the narrative.
That's a very good question. You obviously hasn't read the book, because if you'd read the book...
I haven't read the book.
Yes, if you had read the book, you would know that that betrayal is a central theme of the first book. You need a copy of the book. No, it was one of those things. It's one of the bigger moments in the story. Is he has to lay it out to someone that it's okay for you. You can leave, but some of us can't. And he's tired of getting screwed over by everyone, and he takes his stand because of that. And that is one of those themes, and it actually deals also with some of the main players of the Cultural Revolution and the shift to Taiwan and those sort of dynamics are all part of the first book, Scott. You probably quite like it. And those feelings of I know, and those feelings of betrayal, like you have just betrayed me. Those feelings of betrayal are compounded in the second one, and also looked at from a different angle, and then culminating, obviously, in the third one with something much larger, and that's also going on there. So, like I say, it's not deep, and it's not about those things, but those things are in there, and they sort of do inform characters' decisions along the way. You've had your question now, Scott.
No, but it's a decision. Do you accept it or do you resist it? Betrayal.
Yes. Not for me personally. The characters, some do accept and some do reject, and this is the sort of things. It's not about that, but you can see that some people respond this way. It would be, I think, a little naive and even arrogant of me to suggest how other people would feel about some of those situations. But by creating a set of characters who feel differently about that, then what you just sort of saying, some people feel this way, some people feel that way. This person confronted with that feels like this. Maybe some people in the audience relate to that. In the first book, there's because of AIDS becoming quite a big issue, some people have talked about it being somewhat homophobic. But my reply to that is that was very much a lot of the sensibilities by the majority of the population at the time. And that was a reflection of how people in general were responding to it. And so then people can look at that and go, well, that's not how I would behave. So it's not the author passing judgment on events, it's the events being explored through the characters to a degree. So that's all that is. My personal views would probably be slightly different to the characters. A lot of people say, oh, that's you've put yourself as the first person. That's not true. There's only really one thing he has in common with me, which is a background in advertising. Apart from that, I would be a little bit worried if people thought my life was like that. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard and James.